Welcome to Public Policy Show. We're live from Harvard Business School. My name is Shota, and today we're going to be talking about real incomes and GDP. Children for America, which is one of the think tanks here at Harvard, found fascinating information on real incomes, firm entry, and GDP. So today we're going to look at some of the findings, and let's start with GDP. We know that GDP has been promoted by policymakers, and we've been told over and over that the increase in GDP is associated with a healthy economy and higher standard of living. But results revealed by Children for America indicate that over the past 40 years, increase in GDP of 10% was associated with negative 11.5% decrease in real incomes. Now, how can it be? Well, if we look at rise of GDP since 1948, we see that GDP is increasing in concert with real incomes. But around the year 1980, this changes. We see that increase in GDP is not associated with increase in real incomes, and real incomes are stagnant. Now, if we look at some of the policies that were implemented in the 1980s, it is easy to understand why such a disparity happened. We know that firm entry decreased because of weak antitrust enforcement. Antitrust enforcement in the 1950s and 1960s, on the other hand, was its highest level. We had the golden age of small businesses, and competition for labor was high, meaning employers were competing for more and more workers, and salaries were increasing. Just to look at a number in 1955, we can see that number of new firms that year alone was over 128,000. If we look at 1968, we can see that the number is over 223,000. Now, real incomes from 1950 to 1980 were increasing, and the halt was the result of a policy that was promoting of monopolies, and that ended in the 1980s, actually. So starting in 1980, according to Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, we can see that income disparity between the 95th percentile, meaning higher income earners and lower income earners, was substantially high. So as a result, we see decrease in firm entry and number of new firms in 1988 at 81,000. As we remember, in 1968, we had over 220,000 new businesses. So this trend continued actually in the 1990s, early 2000s, and by 2014, number of new businesses created was less than 13,000. Now, this graph shows clearly that income inequality in the United States is a major problem. And we see that top 0.01% of income earners gained over 450% over the last 40 years, whereas working and middle class Americans, which consist bottom 90% of the economy, have gained zero increase in real incomes. So incomes have been stagnated over the last 40 years. Now let's look at GDP. And one of the key ingredients of GDP is consumption. As we know, GDP is composed of consumption, business investment, government spending, and net exports. Consumption is the largest component of GDP, and it has been increasing in the 50s and 60s. But unlike in the 1980s, where personal debt increased, in the 50s and 60s, high firm entry and high real incomes generated high savings. So people had more money to spend, as well as more money to save. Now, starting in the 1980s, personal debt and associated bankruptcies were on the rise. This increased the overall consumption in the economy, but not personal equity, not personal savings. The next component of GDP is business investment. And we know that market consolidations, which started again in the late 1970s, promoted monopolies, both on stock markets when investors were mainly investing in large cap companies, which are companies that have over $50 billion in market capitalization. And most of lending was benefited large corporations. Commercial lending was increased and small business lending was substantially cut off. The next variable is government spending. We know that government spending has been on the rise, and injection of government money in the economy has mainly benefited monopolies. So in essence, 1950s and 1960s, when we had an economy where small businesses grew, firm entry grew, and real incomes grew, was not imitated in the 1980s, 1990s, and early 2000s. On the contrary, starting in the 1980s, Chinese style economy was adopted, where government is subsidizing large monopolies. So instead of us promoting small businesses and antitrust environment overseas, antitrust was contracted here in the US, and as a result, firm entry decreased. And we saw a substantial increase in income inequality, which is unacceptable. Now, government investment and spending also depreciated dollar. Depreciated dollar meant that purchasing power of consumers is less and less, meaning people spend more and more money on the same product. This also increased national debt. And we know that increase in national debt is also followed by increase in taxes, because interest on national debt has to be serviced. The last component of GDP is the smallest component, but even this variable negatively affects real incomes. We know that imports have been higher than exports over the last 40 years, and this created trade deficit and negatively affected real incomes. So these findings are crucial again, because we know that policymakers are continuously telling us that real incomes and GDP somehow are associated, and increase in GDP somehow means increased standard of living. But from the findings that we were presented today, clearly show that that's not the case. Some of the ways to solve income inequality in the United States is to promote firm entry via innovation centers and enterprise zones. This will encourage more and more firms to enter the economy, and real wages will increase. Thank you very much for listening today. We'll be with you next week at 9 p.m. Have a good night.